I saw him standing behind me. I hadn't noticed him coming in, and I was completely shocked to see him here now. To be honest, I believed he was really dead. His sudden appearance left me speechless. It was really bad right now because I had just walked up to the podium to give the eulogy for my husband lying in the casket in front of me. Just like the last time I saw him 30 years ago, butterflies swarmed in my stomach. My breath caught and my heart began to pound. My gaze and silence must have aroused curiosity among everyone in the sanctuary, because most people turned to look where I was looking. This created even more curiosity, because out of the many people gathered for the funeral, only one person could know who he was. This must be my little sister, Elaine. Looking at her, he realized that she did not recognize him. But I recognized him. There was no way that I wouldn't recognize him. He just stared at me. Then his lips curled into a smile. He nodded at me, turned, and left the funeral home. As Jim's wife for the past 20 years, I had to speak up. I was so shocked that I simply spoke, completely forgetting about my prepared speech. I said something stupid about Jim comforting me when I was going through a really bad time in my life. Of course, I forgot to say what caused this. I talked even more nonsense about having a loving husband and raising our 2 children. I talked about the wonderful, loving relationship that we falsely portrayed to everyone. I didn't spread crap about this alcoholic and loser like I should at a funeral. Naturally, I kept silent about all this. I even cried. It wasn't difficult for me. No one even suspected that I wasn't crying about Jim. I cried because I saw him. I played my part well in the cemetery. I was a grieving widow who had just lost the love of my life. To be honest, that's how it was. It just wasn't Jim. I was actually glad that the bastard was finally dead, and I was free of him. Unfortunately, I didn't realize what an asshole he was until it was too late. By that time, I had already been married to him for a couple of years and was raising our 2 children. Mallory was 5 when we got married. He adopted her after the wedding. Keith appeared soon. I held on to him because I wasn't going to raise my children alone, and I had no other choice. Finally, it was all over. Jim's coffin was lowered into the hole. I threw flowers and a handful of earth into it. My children helped me walk from the grave to the waiting car. I happened to look to my right and saw him standing there. He was standing a couple 100 feet away from me, leaning against a tree. My sudden stop took my children by surprise. I stumbled as they continued to move and pulled me forward. Having regained my balance, I looked at him again and saw that he was leaving. "Bobby!" I shouted. I tried to run to him. Wearing high heels in the grass is not conducive to running. "Bobby! Please! Bobby, stop! Please come back!" I shouted, trying to run away. He never looked back. He kept walking away. "Mother! What the heck?" Mallory asked, trying to stop me. "What are you doing? Who is this man? Please, you must stop him. I need to talk to him. I can't lose him again." "What are you talking about, Mom? Who is he, and what does it mean that you can't lose him again?" Mallory asked. But it was already too late. I fell to my knees, sobbing, as I watched him get into the pickup truck and drive away. My heart felt like it exploded when I lost him again. He wasn't dead. He was still alive. It didn't make any sense. If he was alive, where was he? And why did he never return home? I mourned him. I was destroyed when he disappeared. Now, his sudden appearance destroyed me again. That was 30 years ago, give or take a few months. My wonderful husband, Bobby, was due to return from a business trip this evening. I had wonderful news for him, and I was cooking his favorite dinner to celebrate. There was even a bottle of Merlot waiting for him. I timed it perfectly. He was supposed to return home exactly at 6 in the evening. He'll have time to go upstairs, shower, and change before eating. I was going to tell him the great news at dinner, and then we would spend most of the evening celebrating. I even prepared special, beautiful underwear. 6:30 came and went. Perhaps the traffic was worse than usual. 7 Elo. There may have been an accident on the freeway that caused delays. 7:30. I was already starting to worry. 8 E. Did Bobby have an accident? By midnight, I was in complete panic. At 1 o'clock in the morning, I started dialing his pager number. There were no mobile phones at that time. Maybe if he had been in the hospital, someone would have noticed the pager going off and called me. The next morning at 8:00 a.m., I called his office. No one saw or heard him. I contacted the police and told them I was worried because he never came home last night. They didn't have any information, and they didn't have any accidents last night. I had to wait until the next day to file a missing persons report. All day I called all his friends and acquaintances that I knew about. Bobby has no family left. He was an only child, and his parents died a couple of years ago. Nobody knew anything. I called my younger sister. I panicked, and she came over to comfort me. I kept trying to call Bobby. Early the next morning, I was at the police station filing a missing persons report. I didn't like many of the questions they asked me. They hinted that Bobby might be cheating on me and was simply staying at his mistress's house. I knew him better than anyone. Bobby would never cheat on me. Over the next few weeks, I was depressed. My sister stayed with me and had to keep me as calm as possible. Too much stress would be bad for the child growing inside me. This was the news I was going to tell my loving husband. He was going to become a father. We planned and tried for a while, and finally it happened. The only thing they told me was that they found Bobby's car abandoned at a shopping center 2 towns away. There were no other leads. A month later, I had serious financial problems. I didn't work, and Bobby's paycheck never came. His company fired him for not showing up. I used the money we had in savings to hire a private detective to find Bobby. After 2 weeks of no information, I had no money to continue. Although we had no credit card debt, we still had debt on our home mortgage. Since there was no money coming in, I was already 2 months behind and had no way of catching up. At that time, Jim was a godsend. He was Bobby's best friend, and we had become very close over the past few years. He continued to make sure I had food and everything I needed, but could not help with the mounting bills. Unlike Bobby, who was smart and driven to succeed, Jim was rather lazy and unmotivated. Besides, he wasn't as smart as Bobby. To put it bluntly, Jim was no Bobby. The bank foreclosed on me. Elaine only had a small 1-room apartment, so I couldn't stay there. With no real income, I couldn't afford my own apartment, but Jim rented a 2-bedroom trailer. Having no other options, I moved in with him. After all, he cared about me. Why didn't I try to find a job? Who will hire a pregnant woman who will soon take several months of maternity leave? So let me anticipate your questions. Yes, I moved into Jim's bedroom. It was a 2-bedroom mobile home, so we needed 1 bedroom for the nursery. That left either the sofa or Jim's bed. Besides, Jim took care of me. It wasn't true love, at least not for me, but at least it felt good. No, it wasn't as good as Bobby, but it wasn't that bad either. Eventually, Mallory was born. We called every thrift store and garage sale in the area to get everything we needed for the baby. I will say one good thing. Jim doted on Mallory. I eventually had to get a job as the bills kept getting bigger and Jim lost another job. Since I had not worked or attended college for several years, my options were limited. Eventually, I managed to get a job as a salesman at a local department store. Over the next 5 years, I continued to search for Bobby. I couldn't afford a private investigator, but I used what little I knew about computers to find his name and any other information I could find. I continued to pursue the police on his case, and I checked every detail of every anonymous body that turned up. I never found anything. Finally, I ran out of options. I forced myself to accept the fact that he was dead somewhere, and I would never find him. Besides, Jim put pressure on me to forget him and move forward. I filed for divorce because I was abandoned. 6 months later, Jim and I got married. 6 months later, Keith was born. Over the next 2 years, everything fell into a routine. I went to work. When Jim had a job, we would leave the kids at daycare until one of us left work to pick them up. When Jim was out of work, he looked after them until I got home. I had my tubes tied when Keith was born, so we didn't have to worry about having more children. Jim started drinking more when Keith was 2 years old. It became clear that I didn't really love Jim, and never would. It was more difficult for him to find and then keep a job. When Keith was 5 years old, I first discovered that Jim was cheating on me. I ignored it. I also ignored the second betrayal. Then I ignored everyone else. We became more roommates than husband and wife. I'm not going to say friends with benefits because we weren't really even friends at that point. We still had sex sometimes, but it was just exercise to relieve stress. Over time, I really began to despise him. Looking back, I'm pretty sure I subconsciously blamed him for all my problems. We never had much money and always seemed to be struggling to survive. I tried my best, but I felt pretty miserable. Still, I did everything I could to raise my children right. I think I did it. I couldn't help but compare my new life to the one I had with Bobby. So, we're finally here. Jim's drinking and lifestyle had finally caught up with him. He was in pretty bad shape by the time his heart decided he'd had enough and gave up. A few years ago, Elaine finally married a decent man and they bought a nice house to raise their 2 daughters. Mallory had graduated from college and was now climbing the corporate ladder. Keith decided to join the Navy after graduating from high school, and things went well for him. We just returned to my sister's house after the funeral. I had no desire to return to the rundown mobile home just yet. Besides, after what happened at the cemetery, it was quite obvious that I was in no condition to be alone. "What the fuck, Ellie? What's happened? Who were you yelling at?" Elaine asked, sitting me down on the sofa. "Bobby. My Bobby was there." "Bobby is dead. He died 30 years ago." "No. He was at the funeral home, then back to the cemetery." "Listen, Ellie, it's been a long, stressful day. It just seemed to you, having lost your husband after 25 years, your mind is just playing tricks on you and hallucinating images of your past. You just want to believe that Bobby is still there and will come back for you." "No, damn it, he was there. He's still alive. He grinned at me as well as he knew something I don't know." "Mother, who is he and why is he so important?" Mallory asked. "He's your father, darling. He was my first husband and the love of my life." "What? But you always—" "I thought, how can this be?" she faltered. "Well, where was he all this time?" asked Keith. "I don't know. It's just that one day he never returned home. We all thought he was dead. A week passed before I could bring myself to return to the mobile home. I knew Bobby was out there somewhere. Everyone else thought I was just imagining things. No one could explain who the man was in the back of the funeral home, but they wouldn't believe it was Bobby. I knew differently. Life has returned to normal, as much as possible. Some friends sometimes pressured me to stop after work and have a drink or two. I was still quite attractive for my age, and people would hit on me from time to time, but I always turned them down. Since then, I decided to remain celibate. I knew Bobby was still there and he would be my only one. I won't have anyone else. This was a year later. One evening, I returned from work. I opened the door and entered. I almost fell, suddenly stopping. Bobby was sitting there on the couch. Bobby? I muttered. "Hello, Ellie. Are you here?" "This is true. Where were you, and why did you disappear?" "You know why." "No, I do not know. You just never returned home from your trip. You disappeared. I thought you were dead." "I was dead. Sure, my heart was still beating and I was still breathing, but everything else was dead." "I don't understand." "Ellie, do you remember the last time I returned home from a business trip?" "Of course I remember. I always remember how you returned home from a trip. We always made love all night, and the next day you stayed home to recover." "No, Ellie. The last time I returned home. This was my last trip." "You didn't come home? I waited for you all night, but you didn't come back. It was a Thursday night, and I cooked a special dinner to tell you the great news, but you still didn't come home." "But I'm back home, Ellie. I asked if you remember, but you don't remember. You don't remember how I got home because I came back on Wednesday, not Thursday. Now, do you remember what happened that evening?" He told me what happened after he came home and found me in bed with Jim. He told me about the pain he felt because of our betrayal. He told me how his spirit died right then and he left. He told me about the 2 years he lived on the streets before he woke up from his sadness and began to move on. He told me how he felt like he had lost everything he cared about, especially when he heard me tell Jim that he was actually the father of her child. He said he began using his middle name and his mother's maiden name to hide while he created a new life for himself. He changed jobs and moved constantly, working for cash. He tried to keep up with my life out of curiosity. He knew about the divorce from a public notice in the newspaper. A few years later, he met another woman and eventually got married. They had 3 children, who by that time were almost grown. I was so filled with remorse that I couldn't bring myself to tell him the one important thing I needed. I just couldn't hurt him again. When he left, I simply closed myself in remorse and grief. 2 days later, my sister found me sitting on the sofa. I haven't moved since Bobby left in the evening. I couldn't bring myself to act. I was severely dehydrated and didn't eat anything. She couldn't get me to answer. I just sat there staring into space. Finally, she called Mallory to help her get me into the car and take me to her house. My clothes were a mess, so Mallory grabbed a couple changes of clothes and followed Emily home. They worked together to clean me up and dress me in the underwear and sweatpants that Mallory had grabbed. Then they sat me down on the sofa. They managed to pour water into my mouth so that I could drink it. My only reaction was an occasional tear rolling down my cheek. I sat there for several hours before I finally started to come to my senses. "Ellie?" Elaine asked. "My God, what happened to you?" "It was Bobby. He came to me." "You mean in a dream?" "No. He was at my house when I returned." "Ellie, Bobby is dead. You have to accept this. He didn't die. At least physically. He knew. He caught me, and I never knew." "What do you mean caught, Mom?" Mallory asked. "He returned home, and I didn't notice him." "I don't understand. You waited all night and never saw him come home." "No, not that night. He returned home the night before. He returned home a day early, and I didn't see him." "What are you talking about?" "I had an affair with Jim. Bobby came home a day early to find Jim having sex with me in our bed. We didn't even notice. He heard me tell Jim that he was actually Mallory's father. Bobby just quietly walked away and disappeared. All this time he was alive. He just left me." "Then where the hell has he been all this time?" "Wait a minute. So, if you were having an affair with Jim back then, why did you tell me Bobby was my father? You always told everyone that Jim was my biological father." "I said that because it was easier. Jim helped us, and it made him happy. Either way, the chances were 50-50. I didn't tell anyone that a few years ago I took a DNA test and confirmed that you are Bobby's daughter. Mallory said that Mama was never the same after Bobby spoke to her that night. As far as I knew, she never heard from him again. I tried several times to find him and talk to him, but to no avail. Mom never dated anyone else. She had offers, but she rejected them all. She stopped living and simply existed. Even being with her grandchildren barely relieved her of sadness. I heard her mutter something one day about how she wished she could share this time with her husband. I knew she wasn't thinking about Jim. At my mother's funeral, I was with my husband and 3 children. On the way back to the car, I saw him. He was older than I remembered, but that was to be expected. After telling my husband that I wouldn't be long, I turned and walked up to him. "Are you Bobby?" "Yes," he answered. "Why are you here?" "Isn't it obvious? She was my soulmate. I have always loved her and always will." "Then why did you leave?" "Do you love your husband?" "Certainly. Imagine that one day you come home and find him in your bed with your best friend. Then imagine that she tells him that she is pregnant with his child. What would you do?" I didn't have an answer to this. They were the only people in this world I could rely on in everything. They destroyed everything I believed in. I had to leave before I destroyed them. I eventually moved, but it took a couple of years. Now I have a different life. I have a wife and 3 adult children. I had to come to pay my respects to the woman who once meant more to me than life itself. I'm sorry for your loss. And although I haven't said it before, I'm also sorry for the loss of your father a few years ago. With these words, he turned to leave. I extended my hand to stop him. When he turned around, I spoke. "Mom lied. My father is not dead, and I would like to get to know him a little." A sad smile appeared on his face. He took my hand and carefully removed it from his shoulder. "To become a father, you need much more than just donating sperm. You look like a wonderful lady. Your parents obviously raised you right. It is best to leave sleeping dogs lying down. Now that my Ellie is gone, maybe I can finally find some peace. Goodbye, Mallory. May you and your husband have a long, happy life together. With these words, he left. I didn't see him again. A few years later, I saw his obituary. I actually attended the funeral. I listened to his wife, son, 2 daughters, and several friends talk about what a wonderful person he was. They also talked about the rare bouts of deep sadness he went through. He never spoke about the reasons for his sadness, but after a couple of days, he came to his senses. No one talked about the time he spent before coming to this city, and no one seemed to know anything about his past. I stayed behind so as not to interfere. It was late evening. The funeral was long over, and workers had already filled up his grave. I sat on a small bench near his grave and cried about the losses caused by the stupidity of 2 people a long time ago. If my mother and my father's best friend had not had an affair, my mother and I's life would have been very different. "Are you okay?" A woman's voice came from behind me. Turning around, I saw that it was Bobby's youngest daughter. "Yes," I answered. "I saw you at Dad's funeral, but I don't recognize you." "How do you know him?" To be honest, I barely knew him. In fact, I only spoke to him once. I asked to give me the opportunity to get to know him better, but he refused. "If you only spoke to him once, why did you come to his funeral? Do you remember his attacks of sadness? They were at least partially caused by me. You see, I talked to him at my mother's funeral. He was married to my mother, but he thought that I was not his daughter. I came to the funeral to pay tribute to my biological father. 2 people gave in to their desires. The pain they caused turned into decades of pain and sadness for themselves and several others. My mother and father felt remorse for decades over the destruction of their marriage, the loss of deep friendships, and the loss of the one true love in my mother's life. My biological father suffered the loss of his soulmate, best friend, and daughter. I now suffer from the loss of the opportunity to truly know my biological father. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.